What I think I'm live now. There we go. I did a little one a couple minutes ago. I actually hit the wrong button. They changed up the way you stream live on me. You can't just like get it ready and then hit go, make sure everything's going. So hopefully everything's good. It should be fine. If you're in here and you want to say hi, if you're new, you could still say hi. And you know, the little chat comment thing on there. So we're gonna do chapter 4 here. Figured might as well do one live. I was just sitting here. I was like, if anybody's bored sitting at home not doing something, day before I go back to school, you guys still have another week. But in less than a week, you'll be in school. What? Yeah. So let's get going with our intro like we always do. Let me pull it up over here. I need to set up this thing differently, but whatever. Bow. There we go. All right, here we go. Let's make me smaller. I don't need to be that big. There I am. Oh, this one's got out of sync. Here we go. Life in the 17th century. So there's going to be like colonies and how they're made up and stuff like that. If you watch chapter 3, which you should have, right? You should learn a little bit. This is going to further that. This one's pretty short as well. It's only like 22 slides. So it should be pretty easy here. Pretty quick. We won't bore you for too long. Take too much of your time, right? But here we go. Let me see. Make sure I got everything in place. Yeah, I think we're good. Now I'm going to move this over here because I don't need to see. You can't see what I'm looking at, but I can. Oh my gosh, I can't believe school is tomorrow. Cannot believe it. But it is. So let's go. Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century. You like my new logo? Yeah, spent a lot of time debating that thing, figuring that thing out. So you'll see it. I have a surprise for tomorrow that'll go on the Instagrams. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I am at @apushgreen, and also obviously on YouTube and the TikToks at @apushgreen77. There's a story on that why I'm not @apushgreen on that, but that's for another time. So should be set up. We're good. Yeah, we're good to go. All right, let's get into it. So there we go. The Chesapeake. We talked about it a little bit in the last 2 chapters, right? Just because it's very important that you understand the different regions when we start talking about these colonies, okay? And the problem with the Chesapeake was it's very, very fertile land, but it is also very swampy, right? If you're on here, I know there's 2 people on here. Say hi, say what's up. You don't have to be scared. Don't be scared. And there was a lot of disease. These people did not live long. It was a harsh life. They started growing tobacco, which was introduced by what person? His initials are J.R. I'm not going to give you any more than that. You should know the answer to that one because we already went over it. But we have... look at that. Fewer than half made it to 20 years old. You guys would be like senior citizens. And I would be, Gandalf the Grey in this place. Like, it would be 20 years old, right? And there wasn't a lot of family structure. They didn't have a lot of women. So again, women are important for a lot of reasons, right? But even in a patrilineal society, which is patriarchal, right? It's for the men and men dominated and male dominated, things like that. You still need women to give it a family structure, give the men something to fight for, something to work for, things like that. It makes everything a lot better. So there isn't a lot of family structure, and they had many problems because of it. You didn't have this sense of community here. And the reason for that is if you look at the map, right, and you see all these finger canals that, oh, I forgot my water. Oh well. If you see all these canals and all these tributaries off of the canals, which lead to the bay, which means that you don't need to bring your goods to market. You can just put it directly on a boat, then put it on a bigger boat, and then put it on a really big boat. And then once it gets into the bay, it can just go straight to England or straight to wherever it's going. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if you are like right here next to one of these tributaries, you don't need to go into town for very many things. So therefore, you don't meet people, you don't talk to people, you don't have that community that you have in most other places that have to move stuff overland, and things like that, or things that live on, a port in a city, because everybody just has to go to one port. Your port is your backyard. So that's a big reason for that. So you have orphans. You don't have that sense of community, like I said. And so everything was so much easier to transport to England. So you didn't have these cities, right? Like I said, you can go directly to England from your plantation. Basically, with maybe you might have to transfer, if you're back up on one of these little things, that same boat that you can put it on there is not going to be the same boat that travels to England, but you might only have to do it once, right? So it makes it very easy. You don't need to transport it into a town, into a market, and then they move it from one wagon to the other wagon, and then they got to take it to the port, and things like that, right? It just makes it much easier, and also makes people less community-like. They don't have to deal with each other as much, right? So we have a tobacco economy, right? And this demand for new land, because it's so profitable, because England was like, ooh, this tobacco, and they're just smoking tobacco crazed. They're tobacco crazed, right? They just want tons and tons of tobacco. Probably the only thing that's, is going to supersede it is going to be sugar, right? Sugar, right? And there was a decline, because if you know anything about supply and demand, when you have a lot of something because everybody's growing it, then you have too much of it. And when you have too much of something, then you have a price drop, right? And so when this happens, what do farmers do? They grow more, because they're like, I made $10,000 last year. I have to make that this year. Well, in order to make $10,000, if your price drops in half, you got to make twice as much tobacco. Well, what happens when you make more products? The prices go down even farther. So just remember this conversation that we're having right now before school starts, and then apply that and think about that as we go through the year, because we're going to make the same exact argument for farmers and what they're doing throughout the year. And this is what we can call a continuity piece, things that are happening throughout history, because people don't study it and they think that it won't repeat itself. Spoiler alert, it does, right? So more labor is needed. They need more tobacco farms. So what do? Hey, we can pay some people, or they can just bring in people for free and enslave them, right? So what do? Right? They still want to make all the money. So then we get, we're going to get more and more slaves brought in. Now, again, in the other chapters, slavery doesn't dramatically increase until after 1700. Okay, we're still going to have mostly indentured servants. That's going to be the headright system. If you don't know what that is, maybe you didn't listen to the other chapter lectures, right? But the headright system, things like that, indentured servants, all of these things are going to lead to an increase in workers to work these fields, but it will culminate in the use of slaves later on in the, after 1700, really. So most of the planter elite, and we're going to talk about them most of the time, a lot of times, right? They are going to be controlling everything in the life, especially in the South, right? When we start getting into cotton and real intense slavery, they are going to own so much of the land. They're going to control politics. They're going to control the government. They're, the local and state governments, and then have a huge influx and be able to really sway federal government, all right, because of the money that they're going to start to make, right? But first, let's go back to indentured servants, all right? And so what they're doing is they are exchanging their labor, like I put up there, for a trip to the New World, right? So they don't have any money. So these are poor people back in Europe. They trade. They say, hey, bring us over to the New World. We want a shot at what this is doing for people. And we'll give you 4 or 5 years, sometimes 7 years of your life, years of our life, in order for you to pay for us to get there, right? And the thought was, for majority of them, was they would get land at the end of that time period, whatever they signed for. Now, that headright system, we've already talked about it before, but I put it up here again, right? The people would get, the rich people, the elite, would get more land for the more people they brought over, because they needed people to work the land. So what happens here is they get more land, they get more people, but they're supposed to be giving some of this land away. So they get 50 acres per person, and they should be giving some of that to the indentured servants once they fill their contract. They fulfill their contract. So you get 100,000 of them that are brought over, right? Now, these are not slaves. They're mostly all Europeans, right? But these guys get almost worked to death. At the end of the time, their contracts are basically like, we don't really want you. We're not going to even do it. We're not even going to abide by it. I mean, what are you going to do? Sue us? You're an indentured servant. You're poor as dirt, right? And they could sell them like a slave, right? Sell their contract. Be like, hey, this farm isn't producing as much. I don't want to do this. I'm going to sell you to this guy. You could be in Virginia. You're like, I'm going to sell you to a guy in New England. Now you got to go work up in New England, right? So you have no control over your life, all right? You're not a slave, but you're close, right? And so a lot of them died, and most of them, you see a quarter of them, didn't even get any land at the end. So it didn't work out well for them. Not very well at all. All right. We got a mean break. Let me go back here. I can't believe I forgot my water. Oh, well, I'm not going to go get it. What time? What do we got here on time? 13 minutes. Okay, let's go. Mean break. It's, she's Queen Elizabeth, the original Queen Elizabeth, defeated the Spanish Armada. I know if you have to explain it, it's not as funny, but, just hopefully you guys got it. Bacon's Rebellion, right? So this is not when you ask for bacon for breakfast on your birthday and your mom was like, we have sausage. So we were getting sausage. You're like, but Mom, I want bacon. No, this is not that. So now you get together your brother and sister and you're like, we're not eating. We're not doing our chores till we get bacon. This is not that. Okay? This is Nathaniel Bacon, who was an indentured servant. Okay? And what he decided to do was, because the governor of Jamestown was preferring to trade with the natives in their very lucrative pelt business, furs, okay? Animal furs. And they made tons and tons of money on that. Well, they worked with the Native Americans more than they worked with the former indentured servants. And this didn't sit too well because, A lot of these people do not like Native Americans. They are racist. They are, you just don't like them. So they're like, well, you should be working with us because we are your people more than, but the governor was like, nah, I'm good. I'm going to work with them. They make me more money. Okay. So there's a rebellion, a bunch of people, getting this huge tussle, and they end up burning Jamestown to the ground. The whole city burned to the ground. Bacon's Rebellion. Right? There's going to be a couple rebellions, and you can't get them confused. Bacon's Rebellion's the first one, right? And then we'll talk about the other ones later. Now, again, with College Board, what's the most important thing here? Why did this happen? And what was the effect of it, right? And the biggest one is this first one. Increased demand for African slaves. So this is what changes. This is the marking point for indentured servants. Nah, let's go with slaves, right? That's what they do. This is what happens. You have, up to this point, indentured servants. We do have slaves. They came over for the first time, 1619, and they're slowly gaining the amount, but it's not a full-blown slave bringing it. It's just not. So, importing of slaves, I guess that would be the better way of saying it, right? But that doesn't happen until this. Then, you're restoring voting rights to landless freemen. So if you don't have land, you can vote. And there is class differences in the colonies. But far and away, the most important thing, and the thing that you have to remember about Bacon's Rebellion, is the change from indentured servitude to slaves. Okay? All right. So, slavery in the New World, right? It existed before any of the slave trade in the New World, right? They were using slaves all over the world. They've been using slaves for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? But for our slave trade, right, it is Africa the slaves are being brought over from Africa to both the Caribbean, South America, and North America, right? And this Royal African Company had the monopoly for a long time. And they lost it, right? And the sugar is what really needed the labor. Sugar is much more labor intensive than even tobacco is, because you have to get sugar cane, which just looks like a big green root, and that's what makes sugar, right? But the processing of that sugar cane to turn into sugar is extensive, expensive, and is very labor intensive. All right. So they needed more and more slavery. So they start bringing them over from Africa. Right. And some of the horrible conditions that they lived in on their way over. Now, this wasn't every ship, but it is indicative of some of the ships. So if you look at this picture and can you imagine riding like this for a couple months? Now, you do not move when you have to, do your business, right? So you can imagine, especially if you are one of the unfortunate people on the bottom, right? Everybody has their imagination and you don't want to imagine these things, right? But also, a lot of these people have never been on a ship before. They've never even seen water. They were brought from Central Africa, brought to the coast, and sold onto these ships. So they get seasick. This is where hurricanes come from. So, yeah, throwing up, all the other business that you would do in a 2 month time span. And you can see the conditions. They would come down, wash you off with water every once in a while, but you can see everybody's chained up right where they're at. They couldn't let anybody get loose because then you would have they outnumbered the white people on board, the slave traders, by, a lot. So this is what we call the triangular trade. All right. The New England ships, they went over and they brought rum, they brought guns, and they traded those with the slave traders for slaves. Then they would bring back the slaves, drop some of them off in the West Indies, bring maybe all of them, depending on the ship. Then they would bring some of them up to the colonies and then reload and do the whole thing again. 1, 2, 3. Now, this number 2 is called the Middle Passage. And this is what I was talking about, the worst conditions, right? These conditions were so bad, it changed the migration pattern of sharks because so many people died on the way over that they would just pitch them off the side. And sharks knew that, hey, we can follow this ship and eventually they're going to throw somebody overboard and we have a meal, right? So this is a highly lucrative in a highly, horrible conditions that these people are being subjected to, right? And I think that's it on there. Yeah. So this Middle Passage that I talked about, right? And so it was, most of them came from the center of Africa, and the Western African nations or tribes would go into the Central Africa, bring them to the coast, and sell them to the white traders, all right? And they were chained together. 1.5 million of them died in that Middle Passage, estimated probably a lot more than that. They had slave revolts, whether they were huge slave revolts or small slave revolts, it depended. And so, hold on. Rhode Island did a very good job in the slave trade. They took the lead. That is not a lead you want to take. That is not the win you want in your column, right? But one of the reasons why is, going back a couple chapters, why would a New England colony take the lead in the slave trade? I'll give you a second to think about it. Because they made ships. That was their big thing. Timber, ships, shipbuilding, fishing, all of these things, right? Because they don't have land. They're not as farmers, right? So they're just going to bring in the slaves. They're not going to use them. They're just going to bring them in and sell them and make the money off of them, right? And there is slave revolts on board. The most famous is, I don't know if it's on this. I should put this on this slideshow. But they made a movie about it. Steven Spielberg made it. It's called Amistad. It's a great, great movie. Won Best Picture. I think it was in 1993. Matthew McConaughey's on it. Djimon Hounsou, who you would recognize from a couple of the Marvel movies. He's the main character. He's the slave. It's a very, very good movie where they have a slave revolt. And it washes ashore in the United States. And then there's a court battle to decide who owns these people, or do they own themselves, right? So if you're into those type of movies, you should check it out. Amistad, Amistad, right? Now, colonial slavery, all right. The big one here in 1698. Remember we talked about the slave trade kind of ramping up 1700. That's because that royal monopoly on the slave trade ended in 1698, right? And because of Bacon's Rebellion, all of these things, you're going to have large-scale slavery starting in the early 1700s, all right? You're going to have... Yeah, and that's about it. I mean, all this is just about the rise in the amount of slaves in the colonies, all right? We got 23 minutes. Cool. Then we get slave codes, okay? Now, the slave codes, they are going to, like it says, establish the slaves as property. You can't teach them to read or write. This is all in a response to slave revolts, or the threat of a slave revolt. That's their number one fear. Like to have on the ships is have a slave revolt on land, so they don't want them to read, so they can pass things to each other, so they can organize better, and it all gives them, like I put, a power over their slaves, right? And so you have these rice and indigo plantations, which I'm going to show you. South Carolina is a big one for that, where the Chesapeake is tobacco. You should already know that. We've already talked about it. But they were very close together, which is going to be key here. So there was socialization between slaves, between plantations, right? And then the slave population grew through natural reproduction. I put that on there, right? Because, there you go. By 1750, 3/4 of the slaves were born in America. Right, now, okay, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, horrible things that happened. But, They did have natural reproduction because you see when a man and a woman get together, and well, we're not biology, so we're not going to go into all of that. But there's a thing that happens, right? They, you know, and you make a baby, right? So that naturally happened. It also happened unnaturally, especially when we're eventually going to ban the slave trade in 1800. And you're going to have rapes. You're going to have forced reproduction, which is absolutely horrible. Those types of things will start happening, but not yet. All right. This is one outside of Charleston. Yeah, Charleston, South Carolina, that I went to. I took this picture. Yes, it is a great picture. Thank you very much. I know that's what you were thinking. You wish you could tell me right now. But yes, that's a good picture, and that is called a mirror pool or mirror pond or something like that. I don't know. And that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to mirror the house so you can see it. It's a pretty big house, but it's all pretty much, it's unrestored. And the reason why it didn't get destroyed in the Civil War was because they used it for a smallpox outbreak. So when the Northerners came up, they didn't raid the house and burn it to the ground, because most of these plantation houses in and around South Carolina, in and around Charleston, were burned to the ground. This is one of the ones that stayed there. This is the back of their property. So I was just standing almost at the front when I took that other picture. This is all the way in the back, and you can see how it backs up to a river. And if you ask yourself, oh, that's pretty. Well, why did it back up to a river? Think about it, right? We've already talked about this. Because then you can transport it, right? You can transport all the stuff. It's much easier to transport over water than it is land. So there it is, the Drayton house. And I forgot what the Latin term means on the thing, but this is, one of those stories where, so you see this, how it doesn't look very good, and it's kind of like all crooked and the font's all weird. Well, because they grew indigo, and they would have their bags in rice, and they would mark their bags in rice, right, with their Drayton. So it'd be like, okay, this is ours, that way they can easily identify. Well, they also branded their slaves with that same logo, right? So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because in the 1980s, I think it was the 1980s, if I remember right, or 1990s, the Drayton family could no longer afford to upkeep this house, and they donated it to the National Historic Registry. And now, but the National Historic Registry said, okay, well, you can make a little thing in the back of it. And these little ones had all the different family members from, over time and stuff like that but they decided, right, they're going to use their logo that they branded people with to forever mark their place here. So, yeah, do with that information as you may, right? That's just crazy. This is standing up on top of the house, and when I took that first picture, I was standing right over here, right? And then slave quarters were up here, right up by the road. All right, and this used to be like a big pond thing here. You can kind of tell this tree was insane. I don't think I put the pictures of it in here. So we have African culture in, and they bring it over from South Africa, and it's they would try to find people from their own tribe so they could talk to them, right? But a lot of times slave traders would split them up on purpose so they wouldn't feel comfortable, so they wouldn't have revolts, right? And this was all very thought out. Because as you can see, there was a lot of rebellions. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina which was one of the biggest ones. And it really changed the way slaves were treated in the South. So it was a pretty big rebellion. And yeah, some slaves, you see, they would try and escape, and the Native Americans would let them live with them. And that's going to be a thing too with Andrew Jackson. We'll get to him, in due time. So, what else we got here? Southern society. So we got these curly-tailed guys, and these planters. These were the people who made the money, who made the decisions, who made everything in the South. All right. the political control, and some of them, like I put up there, English country gentlemen. They were not wealthy enough to be actual English country gentlemen, so they were in the country here, and they acted like they were like purebred Englishmen who were living in England, who had families who were, 5th generation, 10th generation English, those type of people, right? So the time of a lot of those people are going to be what we call the loyalists going into the Revolutionary War, okay? And so these people were the ones who control everything. And now the yeoman farmers, they were just regular farmers, and they didn't do a lot, but they were the largest group, okay? And so then you get to the New England family, all right? And let me see. I just want to see where we're at. Okay. Now, the New England family, they lived a lot longer than everybody else. And the women, they married very, very young. You can see have 10 pregnancies. By your age, 16 years old, they're probably either getting married or are married. They did a lot of the work, but they didn't have any property rights, right? The men, they controlled everything, and they're the only ones that could vote, okay? Now, they lived a little bit longer because they didn't have to work quite as hard as the people in the South, and especially the people in the Chesapeake. Remember where we talked about, half didn't even make it past 20. New England families were much stronger. They were much more educated. And because they lived closer to each other, they could have communal schools. They could have things like that. And they had the support of each other in smaller cities, right? Whereas, especially in the Chesapeake, that wasn't really the case, all right? Now, the New England town, like I said, is much more densely populated. And so they could have the towns, they could have the churches, they could have all these things and have a bigger sense of community. All right. And they would have things that came close to developing democracy, not 100%, but make no mistake, everything is based around the church. Everything. Right? There is no separation of church and state. The church and the state are the same thing. Okay. They taught their people a lot more. Boys got more. Women got just enough to learn housekeeping skills, communication, and maybe to teach their kids, rudimentary reading and writing and arithmetic or math, those type of things. Yeah. So then we get the halfway covenant, okay? So remember at the beginning, the Puritans are coming in, the New Englanders, their religious zeal is because they want a more pure religious upbringing. They don't like the way that the Anglican Church was being run, but then they started losing people because they were so strict, and people were like, "You guys are no fun," and so they came up with this thing called the halfway covenant. Basically, it just allowed you didn't have to convert, but you could belong to the church, so you wouldn't have to do all the really intense stuff that they were doing, right? And it allowed them to get more and more people, which gave them more power and more money. Right? So the halfway covenant was very effective. And you need to understand what it is and why they did it. All right? And then we finally have the Salem witch trials, which I'm not going to go over that much because we have an entire day devoted to them, and you will understand much, much more. But basically, I'm not even going to go into it. We'll talk about it later. Okay? And that's the last slide. We're done. How long do we do this in? 34 minutes. That's perfect. Right? So make sure you take meaningful notes. And remember, do not write everything down that I say in these. And you're going to turn them in, I think, on the 25th. So I'll see you. I'm not going to do chapter 5 today. I'll probably do it, I don't know, by the end of the week. I got to go to school Thursday and Friday. So maybe I'll do it on Thursday when I come home. Or Friday. I don't know. We'll see. All right, guys. Have a good one, and we will see you later.